to shout out the International Decade for People of African Descent. This is a UN designation that goes through 2024, so we're definitely lifting up justice for Africans and people of African descent and paying special attention on every issue to ask and to think and to lead with what is the anti-Black analysis here and how do we connect our sustainable development goals and other human rights for our Black people. Just a quick visual here, you know, these are promises that we have made as a human population to not just each other, but also to our children and to our ancestors. You'll see all issues can connect into human rights, everything that we are working for, not just what has brought us here today. Everyone is covered, no one is undeserving. We all are owed these human rights. It puts of the right, all of us, for direct accountability. And we're moving forward. Reparation is key to human rights. This is something that is standard, where not only must human rights violations cease, those of us who have survived them are owed. I'm thinking I might be at 5 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and thank you and welcome you to the U.S. Human Rights Network. We know that you'll stay in touch and share and explore and educate us on some of these ideas and how to get there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eliza, and thank you for reminding us that, you know, the fact those human rights apply to all of us, and those rights that are being codified at the highest level of international law, and the U.S. is bound to those. And all countries around the world have an obligation to ensure that our rights are protected. And there's mechanisms we can indeed use to either denounce when those rights are violated or use remedies or processes that we can use when our countries are not adequately protecting our rights. Something that unfortunately our tobacco control community maybe doesn't use as much as it should. The next speakers are both with the LGBT Cancer Network. So we'll have Gabe Glissmeyer, who's a project specialist at the National LGBT Cancer Network, and then followed by Bryce Moore, who's project specialist at the National LGBT Cancer Network. And they will address respectively the history of tobacco industry marketing to the LGBTQ+ community and follow up with how the marketing has shaped tobacco use and rates today. So go ahead, Gabe and Bryce, please go ahead.
Awesome, thanks, Laurent. So hi, everyone. So we're going to be talking about tobacco's impact in the LGBTQ community across different communities. And pretty much for our time, we're going to be just referring to the word tobacco, but just understand that we're talking about commercial tobacco and not any indigenous or tribal use of tobacco products. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of the history. So you will be seeing some advertisements that are for tobacco companies. This is strictly for educational purposes and just seeing kind of some of their tactics. So how it all kind of started. So originally, you know, the first advertisements for the LGBTQ community largely started around the 1970s in the United States. For the most part, queer community did not like the tobacco industry, mostly because a bunch of the tobacco companies were it was really common for them to give money to anti-LGBT politicians because a lot of those politicians were based in southern states where tobacco is grown. And so while you know, these huge companies were trying to look at our community and be like, hey, you know what, we support you, we support your rights, and we want you to be visible in society, they were also kind of going behind our backs and, you know, having these politicians that were taking away a lot of our rights. And so one organization, ACT UP, which was an HIV/AIDS organization, they actually called for a worldwide boycott of all Philip Morris products. And so that included Marlboro, so the most popular cigarette brand in the world. So then, obviously these tobacco companies didn't like all of that bad press. And so what they started doing is they started giving a lot of donations to LGBT organizations, to HIV/AIDS research, to the arts, all of these sorts of things. But then they also really started putting a lot of money into advertising. So from these examples, something that you'll see in common is that menthol gets pushed a lot in a lot of these populations. And so you'll see kind of these very stereotypical things of what it means to be queer, what it looks like. Sometimes you'll just see ads where they just throw a rainbow on something. And what's fascinating about all of this is that usually they only will have advertisements that are specifically for LGBT people during Pride Month. So in the United States, that's typically around the month of June. Something else aside from print media is that they also will sometimes do LGBT advertisements in emails or on social media. So this is one from Camel from this current year, where they introduced this drag queen who was part of RuPaul's Drag Race, and of course super popular, has a huge platform, and they involved her in a lot of their advertising on their website and then in a lot of their social media as well. And then kind of once again talking about human rights, having these advertisements where it takes these really, really palpable things that, as queer people, it took a lot of fighting for us to have rights to in the world. So, to be able to speak about being queer, to marry, to be able to participate and advocate for our rights. And then in between all of that, they sneak in this to inhale. And I think what's so interesting about this is this ad, typically, I think this showed up in about 2004. And that was about the time when California was starting to do a little bit more work with Proposition 8 and doing a little more stuff around same-sex marriage. And so, we kind of look at that and we're like, oh, 2004 was forever ago. But then in June of this year, we actually got this email about this advocacy event that was happening that was all focused on LGBT issues. And when we looked closer at who some of the sponsors were, we actually saw that Philip Morris International was one of the sponsors. So even though, it's been decades now when they first started being interested in our community as being a very viable customer source of income, they're still very heavily involved in a lot of our advocacy and a lot of our human rights, especially in the United States. So now I'm going to pass it over to Bryce, and he's going to kind of talk about, now that we've kind of seen where marketing has taken us, what that really looks like on the ground as far as our current tobacco use rates go.
Thanks, Gabe. So kind of getting into some of the rates when it comes to LGBTQ plus tobacco usage, the next slide. So we know that when it comes to smoking rates, we know that queer folks are more likely to smoke, and then when compared to the general population, are more likely to use menthol tobacco products more than non-LGBTQ plus people. And of course, just like Gabe was talking about a lot of those ads were heavily menthol ads. And so we definitely see more tobacco ads as well, especially among social media. You can go to the next slide. So this data comes from Rutgers University in July of 2021, and it showed that 54% of bi women who smoke actually prefer menthol, and 50% of lesbian or gay women who smoke prefer menthol. And this is, of course, not surprising at all, especially when you think about how heavily marketed menthol products were to the queer community. You can go to the next slide. So let's kind of talk a little bit about tobacco use within the trans community. We know that unfortunately, most of our trans tobacco stats are very, very old, like 6 years old. And that really is because a lot of gender identity questions are just not asked in terms of surveys and data. And several studies have found, though, that in terms of usage rates, it can vary from as low as 35% to all the way up to 75%. But the truth is, we don't actually know, which really is a great point and something that we reinforce at the network quite often, that it's really, really important to make sure that you are collecting our data and you're collecting data about our community so that we know how to best create programming and cessation and really how we can best, tailor our media and tailor cessation and programming directly to the queer community. You can go to the next slide. So in terms of youth smokers, we know that about 70% of LGBTQ youth who smoke do prefer menthol. Again, not surprising at all. You can go to the next slide. And so we know also that the more discrimination someone experiences, the studies have shown the more likely they are to smoke, and then the more likely they are to smoke and use menthol products. You can go to the next slide. So this side really just talks about the stigma, and it really just reinforces why decreasing the stigma and the discrimination that queer people face is so important, because it greatly increases the tobacco and nicotine use in our community, and it creates more health disparities. And it's really the job of anyone who's working within tobacco prevention and cessation to focus and highly concentrate on decreasing systemic discrimination in all forms. Next slide. And so this is our lovely staff at the network. If you ever have any questions or you just want to reach out to us, feel free. We have an email there. We also do a lot of trainings, around cultural competency, cancer, queer tobacco. So just feel free to reach out if you need any support on anything. I'll also drop my email and Gabe's email in the chat as well, so that you can feel free to reach out to us if you need it. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much to both of you, Gabe and Bryce, and for those great examples and recent examples of advertising and corporate social responsibility, which in many cases seem to be, I know they would be illegal in many countries because they circumvent advertising bans, and even wonder within the MSA whether some of those are legal. And thank you, Bryce, also for a real reminder to us about the importance of collecting this and disaggregate data to very specific populations. It doesn't help anyone if we're able to get very low prevalence for the general population, but then we have groups, and particularly groups that are stigmatized, who then, for various reasons, do not end up benefiting and being able to have the low prevalence rates we want to see when it comes to tobacco use. So thank you for that very important message. Our next speaker is Christopher Rathbone, who's a Canadian lawyer, but who's based in Japan and has lived in Japan for many years, and will discuss how Japan Tobacco has been using the guides to support human rights and LGBTQ plus issues, but really have been using it to promote tobacco products. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me my slideshow started here. Well, first, I probably should describe the situation for LGBT in Japan, because it's quite unique. And in the short period I have, I'll just try to give a thumbnail sketch of it. So although Japan doesn't have any aggressive persecution of LGBT, there is much prejudice and discrimination against LGBT people that they would face in their everyday lives. And there's little legal protection. There's no human rights codes. Some cities have registration of LGBT partnerships. There is little data collected regarding healthcare and access to healthcare for the LGBT, but it could be inferred that it would be inferior to the rest of the population. And in particular, in tobacco control circles, there is yet to be any smoking cessation campaign directed to LGBT people or anti-tobacco messaging. Another factor that's important to understand is the key tobacco company in Japan is Japan Tobacco, which controls 60% of the Japanese market. It is also very active internationally. It would be currently about the third largest tobacco company in the world after Philip Morris International and British American Tobacco. And it's also important to understand that it's owned 1/3 by the government. And as there are no other real large significant shareholders, it's effectively controlled by the government through the Ministry of Finance. And these are some of the brands. Interesting, we saw earlier, Natural American Spirit. Outside of the United States, that brand is handled by Japan Tobacco. And JT is very involved in corporate social responsibility activities. And one of its front groups is Greenbird, which operates internationally, usually in anti-litter campaigns. And I first kind of became aware of the involvement of JT, particularly in the LGBT community in Japan. They regularly receive recognition as an LGBT-friendly company. And this comes from this group, Work with Pride. So previously, they were given commendations on their LGBT policy directly from LGBT groups. But I guess it was rather kind of embarrassing to be directly associated. So, and plus, I know this Work with Pride, recommendations are also given to other companies other than just tobacco companies. Particularly JT, Japan Tobacco, has received many of them. JT was very involved in Tokyo Rainbow Pride, which is the largest LGBT activity which is held in Tokyo each year in May. I think it's held in early May. And previously they were much more centrally involved, but currently I'm not exactly sure why, but they've been kind of scaled back, although they always have a very large booth there. And here it says the Japan JT is seriously training its staff for LGBT. So they have a diversity policy, and here here's the two people from their diversity promotion office. So they receive training from LGBT groups. So there's kind of a quid pro quo there. And here you can see this rainbow by the, I don't know, a lot of people will recognize this. Glow is the heated tobacco product of British American Tobacco. And British American Tobacco was a sponsor. I think that's maybe the first time that they were a sponsor of the Tokyo Rainbow Pride event, very late at night here. Sorry. And sorry, this is my last slide, but this is also, I've heard anecdotally that heated tobacco products are being very vigorously promoted to the LGBT community through bars. This would be a kind of campaign that has previously, until very recently, been used for regular tobacco products. But as HTP is not regulated as a tobacco product, so the tobacco companies are allowed to do promotion techniques that would not be, such as giving out samples, which are currently forbidden for regular tobacco products. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, for exposing these actions by Japan Tobacco International, which seem to be more motivated by marketing objectives than human rights or equity objectives. And also interesting that you point out that heated tobacco products are particularly marketed in Japan to the LGBTQ plus community, taking advantage of the argument that they make, that is, those products should not be regulated as a tobacco product, or they're not currently regulated as a tobacco product. And I know, I've noticed there's a question on that topic already that we will have time to address that during the Q&A section. And next and last speaker of the day is Kelsey Romeo-Stuppy, who's managing attorney at ASH, and she will discuss how the tobacco industry and its products violate human rights and the LGBTQ plus community, and how we can use human rights mechanisms to protect the right to health of all people. Kelsey, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. So as you can see, that's just a tiny bit of information that we're trying to get in a couple minutes here. So please forgive me for going fast, and feel free to ask any questions that you might have. So how do these rights connect with tobacco control? That's sort of where I'm going to start my presentation. Tobacco infringes on rights that everyone has to life, to health, to education, children's rights, women's rights, and so many others. What's the human rights argument for tobacco control to begin with? Everyone has a right to life and to health. The government has a duty to enforce and protect those rights. So the government, therefore, has a duty to protect citizens from the tobacco industry and the harms of tobacco. And if they don't, legal remedies are available at the national, regional, and international level. This is another way, basically, to say that. It's three principles: protect, respect, and remedy. Governments are supposed to protect citizens from the tobacco industry. The industry should be respecting human rights norms. And a remedy, there's a way to fix it when they don't. So human rights in the US are a little different than in a lot of other places around the world. The United States tends to not ratify human rights treaties and treaties in general. So the US has not ratified these treaties on the screen: the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The US has ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the International Covenant on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Here are a couple examples of where legal obligations to protect the rights of LGBTI plus people come from in international law. There's a lot of examples, and I don't have all day to talk about this, although I'd love to. So I just wanted to give a couple examples. The first is very broadly Article 1 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the most basic: all human beings are born free and equal. So that's where we start. But many, many, many international human rights bodies have had some kind of resolution, concluding observation, some kind of statement on LGBT rights. The two that the US is involved in, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination has expressed concern of LGBTI plus people in their jurisdiction, so of African descent. And the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights has made many general comments on LGBT plus issues. So how do we as tobacco control advocates use human rights tools to advance domestic tobacco control? This all sounds very interesting and very lofty, but how do we use it in a practical sense to help further tobacco control to protect LGBT people in our communities? One thing that you can do is participate in tobacco-specific reports to human rights treaty bodies. ASH leads these for the US and helps encourage people around the world to submit it when their country is up for review. We do those specifically on tobacco, but USHRN does them more broadly, and we would love to include tobacco in those. So we would be happy to work with you, and I'm sure Eliza would be happy to talk more about that as well, of how to get involved in both of those. But on a more day-to-day basis, one thing that you can do is launch a communications campaign. Most people who smoke don't view themselves as a victim of a human rights abuse. And that's something that we can help change. We should be changing the rhetoric around that. And further, we should be using human rights language to influence policymakers. No policymaker wants to be someone who's violating human rights. So when we argue that you're protecting human rights by passing a tobacco control law, I think that can go a long way. One example I wanted to give of a success story of using human rights at the local level was the use of international environmental law in the United States. As many of you might remember, the US withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement and the country went wild. Mayors and governors and all kinds of local government people decided that they were going to, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the word. They were going to commit themselves to being involved in the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. And that had a lot of success in the US, even though we did not actually ratify at that point. It was very influential to have the tools of the international community used in our local work. Another example is called Cities for CEDAW. As I mentioned before, CEDAW is the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and the US has not ratified it. But there has been a lot of work around getting cities to ratify it, and it's gone as far as becoming incorporated into some domestic law. The mayor of Pittsburgh actually received an award last year for incorporating this international law. It was specifically on domestic violence into a city ordinance. So that's another great example. On the flip side, we need to use human rights to benefit public health at the international level. And we try to do that with tobacco, but there's a great example from the HIV/AIDS community. And that is that when HIV/AIDS had no presence at the UN, a couple of volunteers showed up and started encouraging the UN to take action on HIV/AIDS. And that spiraled and snowballed, and it became an entire UN dedicated section because of the efforts of a couple of volunteers. So showing up in the international system to talk about our issue is hugely important as well. So I want to give an example of how all of this comes together, because it's kind of very hypothetical. So I want to give a more clear practical example. First and foremost, menthol advertising is still happening all the time. That picture was actually mailed to me personally about 2 years ago. So I just like to point that out. But my example of how it all comes together, as many of you may know, ASH and our partners at the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council sued the FDA for their inaction on menthol cigarettes. In addition, when we sued the FDA, we also filed a report with the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, because menthol advertising is so targeted to African Americans. We used both of these things together to support one another. We wanted the FDA to know that the eyes of the international human rights community were on them. So we made sure the FDA knew that we had filed this with the human rights body, and we used a lot of human rights language in our complaint to the FDA. As many of you know, the FDA has said that they're going to pursue rulemaking. So hopefully we won't need to take this any further with CERD, but we are prepared to do that if it slows down with the FDA or if the rule doesn't come out the way that we need it to. I just wanted to highlight one more thing when we're talking about this. We're already discussing a lot of intersections here, the LGBT community, tobacco, human rights, but there's so many others. In the US, we often talk about social justice instead of human rights. They're not exactly interchangeable, but they often mean similar things. There's been a lot of talk lately about vulnerable populations and health equity, of course, non-communicable diseases, global development. So all of this comes together, and it's so important for us to make sure we're working across issues and supporting each other in this. Again, this is my just statement on the US's terminology of social justice versus human rights. Basically, they work together. Social justice is upholding human rights, and tobacco is a barrier to both. I said this at the beginning, but I wanted to put it back in. This is the things you can do to use human rights in your everyday work, and I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A, or you can feel free to check out our resources on the ASH Tobacco and Human Rights Hub. It's listed here and will be sent out to you after. We also have several listservs that we update people on tobacco and human rights happenings. The action alerts is sort of a broader list, and the Human Rights Tobacco Control Network is a closed list to keep out any tobacco industry interference. And you can feel free to email me if you're interested in joining that. Thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Kelsey. So now we will be moving on to the Q&A section of the panel and the webinar. Again, feel free to type them in the Q&A box using the icon at the bottom of the screen, and feel free to direct them to a specific, you can direct them to a specific panelist. So I have, I will probably go back to the questions that was asked about heat not burn earlier, but first I have another one. In the context of using legal recourse and legal action in a country like Japan, for example, where the LGBTQ plus community is actually fairly discriminated against, and at the same time, you have very specific directed marketing. So are there specific legal actions and recourses that could be used? And that obviously would go to any country, given that the LGBTQ plus community is highly discriminated almost across the board in almost every country. And at the same time, also very much targeted by the industry. Are there specific things that could be done or should be done? And I don't know if Eliza, we have a few lawyers on and obviously Gabe and Bryce may have some ideas also, but open it to any of the panelists.
Laurent, can you rephrase legal action for what exactly?
So in context where we have already very high levels of discrimination against a specific population, and at the same time, when the industry is supposed to not be marketing products and under other international treaties, including the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and they're still doing it. And they're obviously in some cases, like in Japan, trying to argue that they don't fall under tobacco products. But the example that Gabe presented there was this one specific advertising on one trans night which was very clearly also I think a violation. So what are legal things that could be done?
Well, I would say, sorry. Oh. In the case of Japan, what I failed to mention was that because the government owns 1/3 of JT. Any group, many groups involved in human rights are very reluctant to say anything about tobacco because they would like to get the cooperation of the government in their group. And that's the same for LGBT, because they have currently a big push to have equal marriage in Japan. And surprisingly, a large amount of the Japanese population supports that. They don't want to be critical. They seem to be critical of the government, because criticizing tobacco is essentially in Japan, that's criticizing the government. So that's kind of unique to Japan. I was interested to see that early on in the United States that the LGBT community had kind of a hostility towards the tobacco industry because of their support for right-wing politicians, very hostile people who are very hostile to LGBT. And ironically, that's kind of the same thing in Japan, because although a large amount of politicians in Japan, probably the majority, receive support in some way from the tobacco industry, they would tend to be more hostile to the LGBT community than those who are not. But in Japan, just to finish off, in Japan, there's never really been much luck with, so far, the only successful legal suits have been basically related to people smoking on balconies. And there's never really been any successful legal strategy to challenge the tobacco industry as there has been in the United States and other countries.
So are there any in the United States, Gabe, Bryce, are you familiar of any very specific litigation that would be taken on by groups that would really address that issue? Are you aware of any such actions right now for the specific marketing to the LGBTQ plus community? Is that being addressed legally?
I'm not aware of any in the US that are specifically going after marketing. I know a lot are going after, obviously, flavor bans. So understanding that menthol is pushed a lot in queer communities and also in the Black community and Latinx community as well. But yeah, as far as marketing specifically, not really. I know there is a lot of push about when we do tobacco prevention work or any sort of flavor bans or anything like that, having a recognition that, a lot of LGBT people use tobacco products in place of, mental health services, which are very hard to access in the United States, unfortunately. And so just kind of having an awareness of, when we take away tobacco products, also making sure that we, fight for universal health care in the country and, humanity for all people. So I think that's kind of the bigger push right now.
I think I can answer a little bit of this. In the US, it has to be a violation of a specific law, and there's no law against marketing in that manner. So I'm not sure how you could exactly bring that. I will say that the lawsuit we were involved in against the FDA for marketing menthol was an administrative lawsuit for something the FDA was failing to do. And that will obviously have a broader protection than just African Americans, including the LGBT community very, very much. So that is one example of sort of the way to get around it. Around the world, there's much easier, clearer examples. The European Court of Human Rights would be a very easy place to bring a challenge like that. But in the US, it's a little harder. I don't know, Eliza, did you want to talk about that a little more?
Yeah, briefly, I'm an attorney here in Chicago, Illinois. And, I can tell you just as a Chicagoan that examples of how even when you win lawsuits, that doesn't necessarily change or make government and corporate behavior adhere to human rights, because they might just pay out, or they might just make, make it a practice instead of a policy. So one example that I think is one of many that are so transferable across issues is maybe 10 years ago, our juvenile detention center, where children are kept in like a city jail pre-adjudication as young as 10, had some serious human rights issues. And a group of youth who had been locked up or had family and neighbors locked up were, pointing to that. There had already been a lawsuit that same season that won and said conditions must improve. But after that, the county government that ran it was, laying off janitors to save money, to the point where the children impacted had to be the ones to really stand up and say, there's no one here even doing the laundry. You have, et cetera. So when they try to have a meeting, actually, with the administrators, right? You can always look and see, within our governments, where are the points where someone can actually make a decision today to respect a certain human right. And the youth went, they, made phone calls, made a formal letter. Can we talk to you about this? They were told, no, you're, some delinquents. I'm not talking to you about, my job. And then they went in a protest with about 200 of their friends, and they delivered to the county board meeting boxes of 400 pairs of children's underwear, saying, we're really concerned. They had signs that say, treat us like humans, not animals. And they, educated the media about what was going on. And the next day, the US government intervened, took control of the facility, agreed to make these youth leaders, mind you, who had come out of detention and stood up as human rights champions, human rights monitors, where they had the right to go in each month, meet with the head federal administrator after going in and out of the actual units where the cells are, to interact, speak to, gather data and analysis from the children who were caged. Is X, Y, and Z getting better? Is what's next? What could there exist in our communities where this wouldn't be necessary? And policies were indeed changed, and up to, I believe it's over 500,000 a year now, for many years since then, has been redirected to community-led programs that actually support youth human rights in the communities. So basically, that's an example of how, litigation is not our only tool. And coming from Chicago, there are other aspects of the law. We can make new law. We can insist that our laws and our practices of our governments and corporations do that. And how do you do that? You find the decision maker and you make it clear. And that takes movement building, amongst us and at y'all's leadership, of bringing stories, facts, data, and creating a moral imperative, like Kelsey mentioned, right? Who wants to be on the wrong side of human rights? So that's how we do it in Chicago. All right.
You bring a very good point. It's about how we frame a certain issue as a human rights issue, and use that framing to elevate and create more of a global priority around this issue. This reminds me a little bit about the way for example, HIV/AIDS community was very effective in using human rights mechanisms and arguments to ensure access to retroviral drugs. And they did that, for example, in Brazil and South Africa, and basically forcing the government to make sure that free access to those retroviral drugs. And so I have a next question on this. So for example, how do we elevate the issue and to make sure to really denounce and frame that industry manipulation and targeting of a specific community? So for example, the UN Human Rights Council, which is the largest intergovernmental body responsible for monitoring and promoting human rights around the world. And I've noted that, for example, I believe it was in 2016, they passed the last resolution protection, different sexual orientations, and so on and so forth. And so my question to the group is: the U.S. is obviously bound to those UN institutions, and so how could we maximize on that from a communications perspective, and to elevate the problem in a sense of urgency, given that the industry is really still so focused on targeting those communities? Did I make sense with my question?
I think so. I can start. I think it's so important to be using human rights arguments at every level of advocacy, local, regional, national, regional in the America's regional term, and then internationally. When we talk about at ASH, we're involved in tobacco as a human rights issue. We're trying to influence from the top down, from the UN Human Rights Council, all the way down to local government. We want the UN to view tobacco as a human rights issue, and we want local governments to view tobacco as a human rights issue. And I think the more groups that we can pull in on that, the better, especially groups that have used human rights successfully in the past, like the LGBT community. And I think the environmental community is another great example recently of people who've been using human rights arguments very, very well. So Bryce, Gabe, somebody?
Yes, Bryce, Gabe, anyone else has any other thoughts on this? No? I quickly want to go back then to the question, that the issue that Bryce, you brought that up, and there's a kind of a question and an offer coming up from one of the attendees, from Vicky Casanova Willis, who's asking basically whether there's an interest in this, and whether there would be people interested in that part. But I'm wondering also from Bryce, are you aware of data collection taking place? I know that this is something that has been discussed here, even within the UN system. We're very frustrated at times. As you know, there's some global agreements to achieve certain targets on tobacco, but we don't collect often, even male, female. They don't have that data in a lot of countries. They just have smokers. And it's so important to be able to have data on various segments of the population. Are you doing anything? And what would be your response to Vicky Casanova Willis's question on how do we get started on starting to collect that data and working together and setting up scorecards on that topic?
Yeah, well, I mean, those are some excellent questions. I mean, I think, especially in terms of what we're doing at the National LGBT Cancer Network, we're really making sure every single presentation that we give, we are going to mention how important it is to collect our data and what collecting our data means, right? And the importance of doing that. And I think just, continuing to impress upon the importance that data is collected and then what we can do from that. We have been so fortunate to work with so many local and state governments and municipalities to really kind of start crafting, when it comes to their specific work plans, when it comes to their health needs assessment, really making sure that they are even thinking about doing a LGBTQ health needs assessment to really find out what are the specific needs and disparities within their local community. And I really think that that's absolutely so important. A lot of times, even just, people can tend to kind of neglect that local data, but it's really, really important to collect it, especially, so that you can then find out how best to address the needs of that specific community. And then in regards to the question, yeah, I mean, we would absolutely be interested. Feel free to email us. I'll definitely make sure to drop my email and Gabe's email down in the chat, and we can always connect. And we at the National LGBT Cancer Network are always open to doing more trainings and doing anything that we can, whether that's sign-on letters or just whatever that we can to really make sure to push the importance of making sure to collect LGBTQ plus data. I don't know if
thank you, Bryce, for that.
To add on to that, or
I don't know if anyone wants to add to this, but one of the things that I find very encouraging and very useful about using a human rights-based approach is this ability to work with different groups that have different agendas, but that are mutually reinforcing. And that's so critical. One of the key challenges when it comes to tobacco control is that it's tendency to work in silos and this lack of whole of government approach. And very often, and we work all over the world and very involved with the tobacco treaty, and outside of the health ministry, someone they don't even know about the tobacco treaty and they don't care about tobacco control. It's even perceived as, well, you won that war already. You already, this is a problem solved. So I think this ability and to some, you kind of suggested that, Bryce, yourself with your intervention now, is that really this working together across agendas, we can really reinforce each other, which is, I think it's so critical.
And can I also just add one more thing? That's, it's something that like we commonly notice, especially because, we don't just work on tobacco. And we've seen so often among LGBTQ plus spaces and even health spaces that tobacco isn't their number one issue, or they don't feel that tobacco is their number one issue, right? And so it's really important just to remind folks about kind of not just the marketing, but also the usage rates. And that's why, like I said, it kind of goes back to why we need that data to really help show that and impress upon, the general population, of course, but also the LGBTQ plus community, the importance of making sure that we prioritize, tobacco and really see it as, the human rights issue that it is.
Thank you so much for that very, very perfect intervention. I'm conscious of time, so we'd like to give an opportunity for any or all of the panelists to give your last parting words before we conclude this webinar. I'll start. Eliza, do you have any last words of wisdom you'd like to share with the group?
Oh, just let's stay connected. I put the link to sign up for USHRN emails, which, is a start, in the chat. So let's work together and bring human rights home.
Chris? Anything you want to add before we part?
Well, in the case of Japan, international pressure is so important. If the Japanese government feels that it can take these kind of actions to market products, the vulnerable communities in Japan, if they feel that there's going to be awareness of it, they may change their approach. So, and I'm happy to be able to present this information. I don't think a lot of people probably are aware of it. So, thank you.
Okay, that's a very good point. We had submitted a report to Japan in the past, but I think we could do more. The human rights, the process, the reporting process associated with governing bodies of human rights treaties really provide a great approach to put international pressure, and this is something that as a public health community we should do more of. Bryce and Gabe. Bryce already. Bryce, any last words, and then Gabe, and then Kelsey. Bryce.
Yeah, I mean, not really, just, we are a fantastic resource at the National LGBT Cancer Network. So we have a whole resource library that you can feel free to use any of the resources that we have on our website and reach out for support.
Thank you, Bryce. Gabe?
Yeah, I'll kind of echo that. Just reach out to LGBTQ people, work with us. We want to work with you on these topics. If you don't know of any local LGBTQ organizations in your country, state, anything like that, you can reach out to us. We have a lot of partnerships and with organizations kind of in different countries as well. So yes, please work with us. We definitely want that.
Thank you. And for Ash, it's definitely a pleasure to work with you and with your organization. Kelsey.
I just want to echo Bryce and Gabe. ASH has a ton of resources for tobacco control advocates trying to work on human rights issues, including talking points and all kinds of more simplified documents on the human rights information that I threw at you very quickly. So please check that out. And thank you, and keep in touch.
All right, well, thank you to all of you for this wonderful panel, wonderful presentations. Thank you to all of the attendees for joining us from all over the world. Stay tuned for future webinars. ASH has an ongoing set of webinars, so stay tuned and join us for the upcoming ones. Thank you very much, and we'll keep in touch. Bye-bye.